Good morning again. So, before I jump into my sermon this morning, I want to encourage you, if the Pew Bible is within reach, grab a hold of it, because I'm going to encourage you to follow along at a certain point this morning. I know I don't do this very often, but there is some richness to this story that I want us to grasp. So, when I refer to those words, you'll have it handy. So, now I wonder, in your own lives, has there been anything that you wanted so much that you saved for months to buy it? I'm hearing chuckles. I'm guessing that's a yes. Okay. I remember when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I wanted a TV for my bedroom. And I wanted it so much that I saved for almost an entire year. I remember saving my $1 a week allowance for the first 9 months of the year, which amounted to roughly $40. And then keeping the money that I received from, do you guys remember kids walking around with those kits that had cards that you could buy? I used to do that in my neighborhood, so I saved all the money that I raised from selling those cards. And then I saved all the money that I got for Easter presents and my Easter basket, which amounted to probably about 50 cents at the time, but it was still going towards this TV. I saved all my money for my birthday, and finally, I had enough money to buy that little 12-inch black and white TV. Do you guys remember those little TVs with the dials on them? One for VHF, one for UHF. If you turned it around, there was a horizontal and a vertical. You guys remember those? It didn't have a cable hookup on the back, but an antenna. Okay. I had one of those in my bedroom, and that's all I wanted that year. And if my memory serves me right, that little antenna was almost bent off when that TV finally died from moving it around so much. But I remember saving for that TV was so hard. Well, number one, because I'm a kind of person that doesn't like to save their money too long. I usually have money in my pocket and I spend it. But aside from that, my $1 a week allowance was usually spent in 1 or 2 days. And yes, for anybody that's not familiar with it, you could actually spend $1 over a couple of days in that time. When penny candy was still a penny. Actually, you got 2 or 3 pieces for a penny. But I worked so hard for that little TV because I loved coming home from school in the afternoon, turning it on and putting on the one station that would play TV shows like The Addams Family, The Munsters. Of course, Scooby-Doo was in there somewhere. Right? Those are the things that I remember the most as a kid. And I often watched Gilligan's Island. But those are the things that I wanted to do. Does that bring back memories for anybody else? Okay, good. Because I loved that TV. Here's the thing. I wanted it so bad for so many reasons. The main one was that I wanted to be able to watch what I wanted to watch rather than what my father put on the TV in the living room. And so I was willing to give up some of my most favorite things to do when I was a kid. If my mom couldn't find me, she would look out in the yard to see if my bike was in the yard. If it wasn't there, I was riding it up and down the street. Or I was up at the hills riding that, and ask me about that later, I'll tell you about that. I was an active kid. I was out playing football with the neighborhood kids, or I was playing baseball or basketball. But I stopped doing that for that entire year so that I could save up my money to get that little TV. I did every chore I could. I earned every dollar I could. My desire was so strong that it kept me from doing the things that I love to do and separated me from my friends. Has anybody else had an experience like that in their lives? If not, I hope you never do get to experience it, because it did. That TV separated me from others. And like I've mentioned over the last few weeks, much of Jesus' teaching that we have been studying has been about relationships, right? Our relationship to God and our relationship to others. There's that cross symbol again. In particular, this one is about our relationship to God. And part of what I think he's trying to tease out of this for us this morning is this idea that we need to care for our relationships as much as we care for others. Maybe even teach us that in our own self-centered lives, when we care more about ourselves, in which we care about what we have or do not have and accumulating more is actually drawing us away from relationships. While I'm sure his teaching had nothing to do with today's consumeristic world, it is still interesting that the teaching applies to our world today, maybe even more so than in his time. So let's break down the passage a bit and spend a few moments thinking through what Jesus is telling us. At the very outset of this passage, we hear right away about greed and family values. Now, one thing to bear in mind with the question being asked is that many, if not all of those gathered around him, would have known these laws. They would have known about how when a father dies, the inheritance was split amongst his sons. How it worked at that time was set down by laws created during the time of Moses and Aaron. So there really wasn't a question of how it should be done or how much this person was to receive. It was already laid out for him. And all this is to explain why Jesus likely did not want to give him a straight out answer, because he already knew it. But he also didn't want to get involved in a conflict between the brothers, because the conflict likely stemmed from greed over the father's estate. And as we know, greed can get us in all kinds of hot water, can't it? And so at the heart of what Jesus does is to correct the thinking of those around him, meaning he was going to give them a tale that they would understand, likely identify with, and also give them some fire and brimstone talk so that they would all adjust their thinking to help them with their relationships. First with God, which will impact their relationships with others. You see, like many people today, the people with whom Jesus was surrounded had moved away from God and away from their faith to the point that they were arguing over something that was already laid out for them. So clearly, there was nothing to argue about, right? Let me ask you this question. How often do you see families divide when a matriarch or a patriarch dies in the family? Right? It still happens today. But what Jesus is saying is essentially, look, you need to get your hearts and minds focused on what is right and right in front of you. Or when you die, you'll pay a hefty price. It's a warning about how they were acting, and to be brutally honest, it's a warning about how we are acting too. Now, I'm going to try not to browbeat you all too much this morning, because that's not my style, but this passage really begs for me to do that, so please understand that. But it calls us to consider what's important in our lives and what's important to us. So let's listen to an abbreviated version of Jesus' story in my words. All right, ready for this? Joe has a farm. Each day he tends to it, growing grain to food to sell. He's had a good year so far, and the previous 3 weren't too bad either. His crops have been so plentiful that he did not sell them all. But he knows that if he stores it up, when things are not so good, he's still going to make money. He's still going to be able to survive. So he takes his money and builds some bigger silos and barns so that he can make sure that all the grain and the spoils or his crops do not spoil. When he's done, he goes out, harvests more, and thinks to himself, I'm good for the next 3 or 4 years. I can go sit back, relax, have a few beers, and just kind of hang out. Sound about right? Does that sound like anybody you know? Maybe a few of us know a couple of people like that. Is that not what many of us do anyway, right? Whether we're a farmer or not, how many of us had a retirement savings? Right? Now, I know some folks in our corporate world who right from the beginning of their careers put away the maximum amount that you can put away into a 401k, effectively building up thousands. And in some cases, at least one case, I knew a person who had accumulated $3 million in less than 15 years in her 401k. She effectively built up this mass fortune, all so that she could relax in retirement. The interesting thing is that I know just as many people who, when they retired, died before they could spend all that money. Now, again, please don't hear me wrong. Saving for retirement is not wrong. But the idea and thinking that everything we have is attributed solely to what we put into it and our efforts is wrong. Being fiscally responsible is not wrong, but the idea that we have what we have solely because of the effort that we put into it is wrong. We need to adjust our thinking here and as a society as a whole. And I know I've said this before, but what we have and who we are is not a result of our own efforts or our own doing. God has something to do with it, right? Okay. I'm glad to see some heads doing this. Now, here's where I want you to open up those Bibles. If you look at verses 16 to 19 in Luke, how many times do you see the word I in those verses? See, now this is why I invited you to open it up beforehand. How many times do you see the word I? That is on... Thank you. 847. 6 times, Carol says. According to my count, it is 6 times that the word I appears in 3 verses. That means it's in there at least twice a verse, right? Now, how many times do you see the word my, M-Y? This one's a little easier. You don't have to count, you don't have to use more than one hand. 1 time, right? It appears 1 time. Just in verses 16 to 19. Maybe I miscounted. M-Y, just the word M-Y. Okay, all right, then I miscounted. See that? You guys are doing better than me. Now, here's the biggest question of all. How many times do you see God referred to in those verses? 0 times. What do you think that says about this guy that Jesus is using as an example? Selfish. He's more interested in himself and the things that he has done, what he has given for himself. He does not acknowledge once that God has provided anything. He has not given credit where credit is due. Again, not unlike many in our society, right? And this man in the parable has only thought about himself, what he has done, what he has accumulated, what he has grown, what he has been able to store up for himself. Nowhere is there a mention of God in that story. And I wonder how his other relationships might have also suffered because of a clear lack of relationship with God. To me, this passage is calling us to consider what it is that God does for us and how our relationship with God affects us in so many ways. And where I see that the most is in the next 2 verses, verses 20 and 21. It says, "But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?' This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God." And I go back to my coworker. This particular woman had in less than 15 years with the company amassed a fortune in her 401k. And she still had about 30 years to work. Can you imagine how much money was accumulated in that account? She had no children, no spouse, was rapidly approaching an age when children would not be possible. And if she were to get pregnant, it would be very risky. Now, that's not to say that what she was doing was wrong. But I would chat with her and she would say things like, "Our farmer, I just want to not have to worry about money when I retire." Now, I don't know about you, but I could definitely spend all that money. I would have no problem spending that money. And so my wife sits there and goes, uh-huh, without question. But would it make me any happier in my life? Would it make me any happier in my relationships? And I'm going to say likely not. The one thing that I cannot help but wonder is if God would say something similar to her that God said to the man in our story. You foolish woman. You saved, but you're not going to get to enjoy it because your life, your folly, and your foolish ways are coming to an end tonight when I claim you for myself. You forgot about the one thing in your life that can truly give you what you need. I mean, this story truly calls out to us to consider what our daily greed is doing to us. It calls us to consider how we are spending our wages and time and talents each day. Do we act like the farmer and want to store up all of our money, all of our goods, and all of our excesses here on earth so that we can enjoy them later without consideration of whether or not later will come? Do we think about all that we have as a gift from God that should be shared with others? For me as a child, that TV that I saved for nearly a year did not give me anything other than strained relationships, including with my family. While I enjoyed it, I was also not enjoying the friendships and the relationships I had and the talks and the conversations that I had with family and friends. And so as we consider our lives, our savings, and the things that we want in this life, if God were to come in through that door today and look at us, I wonder, would God say that we have given all that we could to those who need it? Acknowledging that nothing we are or have is of our own accord. Or would God chastise us for our foolish greed? If it's the latter, then maybe we need to adjust our thinking, just as Jesus encouraged those around him that day to do as well. And I'm going to leave you with that question hanging in your hearts and your minds, because it's a question that we each need to face. Amen.